All right, let's talk about one of the oldest, most enigmatic and chilling places in the entire Imperium of man, the Tower of Hegemon. You might be thinking, another ancient fortress on Terra? But no, this isn't just another relic of the past. This is where it all began. Before the Imperium became the galaxy-spanning empire of today, before the Great Crusade, before even the primarchs had names, the Tower of Hegemon stood as the first true seat of the Emperor's vision. It's not just bricks and vaults. This place is a layered monument to ambition, secrecy, war, and the kind of authority that bends worlds. The tower was the heart of the Unification Wars, the nerve center from which Terra itself was tamed. And ever since, it has remained a place shrouded in silence, guarded by shadows, feared even by the highest lords who walk the corridors of the Imperial Palace. And here's the thing. No one really talks about it. You'd expect tomes of Imperial history to sing of this tower's glory. Instead, it's kept in the footnotes, hidden beneath the pageantry of the Emperor's golden throne or the soaring spires of the Astronomicon. Why? What's in there that even the Adeptus Custodes avoid mentioning? If we really want to understand the roots of the Imperium, the true face of what was forged during the darkest era of Old Earth, then we need to go back to the first fortress, back to the Tower of Hegemon. The Tower of Hegemon isn't just a place, it's a symbol. And not the kind of symbol carved into a monument with a plaque and some flowers. No, this is the kind of symbol that bleeds into the bones of history, that seeps into every crack of the Imperium's foundations. It's the first real seat of power the Emperor claimed for himself. Long before the Golden Throne or the Imperial Palace, before Terra became the beating heart of a galaxy-spanning nightmare machine, there was this tower, and it still stands. That alone should tell you something. Located at the heart of what we now call the Imperial Palace complex, the Tower of Hegemon has been almost completely swallowed by the sprawling mountain of Gothic architecture and layer upon layer of fortress city construction that has consumed old Earth. But originally, it stood alone, massive, monolithic, and defiant against the chaos of old night. It was positioned strategically, near the cradle of the Himalasian mountains, where the Emperor's gene forges, laboratories, and command centers could be protected by the terrain and hidden by the storms of the dying age of strife. Fans often speculate that this wasn't accidental. The Emperor didn't just want a fortress. He wanted the perfect fortress, remote enough to be defensible, but close enough to the centers of pre-unification power to strike when the time came. There's something haunting about the way people talk about it. Some Imperial scholars still refer to it as the Tower of Beginnings, while others, especially those deep in the ranks of the Administratum, don't like speaking of it at all. It's as though the tower represents something too raw, too honest about the Imperium's roots. Because while the ecclesiarchy loves to paint the Emperor as a god of light and salvation, the Tower of Hegemon is a monument to something far colder: control, consolidation, and the brutal unification of Terra by fire and steel. The sheer scale of the place is staggering. Old records describe it as having stood over 300 floors above ground, with another 100 beneath, though many believe that number barely scratches the surface. The visible tower is just the tip of the blade. Beneath it lies a subterranean labyrinth that predates even the War of Unification. There are stories, never officially confirmed, of course, that some of the lower vaults were once part of a lost pre-imperial civilization co-opted by the Emperor during his early rise to power. Some say he built the tower atop those ruins on purpose, to tap into whatever ancient secrets they held. Architecturally, it was never meant to be beautiful. That's one of the things that makes it so eerie. While the rest of the Imperial Palace is adorned with statues, gold filigree, stained glass, and impossibly tall spires, the Tower of Hegemon remains stark. Solid black stone, no windows, no ornamentation, just towering, oppressive mass. Fans sometimes compare it to a blade jammed into the ground, or a tombstone marking the death of the old world. And I get that. There's something undeniably funereal about it, like it's not just a fortress but a warning. Its significance can't be overstated. This was the center of operations for the Unification Wars. This is where the Emperor directed his genetically engineered armies, where he crafted the blueprints for the Legiones Astartes, where alliances were forged and betrayals were dealt with in silence. It wasn't just a place of war, it was a forge for empire. And for a time, it was the most secure location on the planet. No one entered without clearance from the highest echelon of the Proto-Imperial Command. No one left without being changed by it. Even today, the tower is said to be guarded by contingents of the Adeptus Custodes. That should raise a few eyebrows. The Custodes aren't posted just anywhere. They protect what the Emperor deems absolutely vital. Some argue that their continued presence there is symbolic. Others believe they're guarding something far more dangerous than data archives or war relics. Theories range from gene vaults containing failed primarch prototypes to ancient technologies that even the Mechanicus refuses to catalog. There's even a particularly fringe but persistent idea that the tower houses one of the Emperor's original bodies, an early iteration perhaps, or a failed clone. Sounds wild, I know, but in the grim darkness of the far future, is anything really off the table? And yet, for all its historical weight, the tower remains curiously absent from Imperial propaganda. You'd think the ecclesiarchy would have enshrined it as a sacred site, turned it into a pilgrimage destination, filled it with relics and incense and choirs. But they don't. It's as though the tower speaks to a version of the Emperor they'd rather forget. The calculating warlord, the gene crafter, the conqueror of Terra. Not the serene god king on the golden throne, but the master of thunder warriors and orbital bombardments. The tower isn't about hope or salvation. It's about origin, and origins in this universe are rarely clean. The reason we don't hear much about the tower isn't because it lacks importance. It's because it reveals too much. It stands as a relic of a time when the Imperium was an idea still drenched in blood, when loyalty was bought with victories, not dogma. And maybe that's why I find it so fascinating. Not because of what's inside, necessarily, but because of what it represents. In a galaxy filled with lies, myths, and half-truths, the Tower of Hegemon is one of the few things that still feels real. Solid. Unflinching. And that makes it dangerous. If there's one thing you notice the moment you see even an old sketch or schematic of the Tower of Hegemon, it's how wrong it looks. And I don't mean that in a sloppy, accidental way. It's deliberate. The tower wasn't built to impress. It wasn't meant to inspire awe or admiration like so many other imperial structures. It was built to dominate, to suppress, to outlast. It radiates control in the most terrifying sense of the word. Fans sometimes joke that it looks like it was designed by someone who hated light, beauty, and comfort in equal measure, and that's not far from the truth. According to the rare scraps of data that survived the Age of Strife, construction on the tower likely began before the Unification Wars had truly kicked off. That would place it in a time when the world was still clawing its way out of techno-barbarism, where knowledge was fragmented and advanced construction was a luxury of the few. So who built it? That question alone has sparked a dozen theories. The mainstream belief is that the Emperor commissioned its construction personally, using a combination of pre-Dark Age technology and his own knowledge, which, let's be honest, was probably centuries or even millennia ahead of anyone else on the planet. But others believe the truth is murkier. Some fringe theorists suggest that the tower wasn't built so much as reclaimed, a relic from a forgotten age, possibly even a piece of Dark Age infrastructure repurposed by the Emperor. They point to the strange material used in its outer structure, something that doesn't match any known type of stone or plasteel, dark as obsidian but harder than adamantium. There are stories of blades snapping and tools breaking against it, of Mechanicus scanners returning blank slates as if the tower simply refuses to be measured. The Adeptus Mechanicus, of course, stays quiet on the matter, which, if you ask me, makes it even more suspicious. The internal architecture is just as eerie, forgets symmetrical halls and logical layouts. Inside the tower, corridors bend in unnatural ways, elevators lead to different destinations depending on the day, and entire floors are rumored to appear or vanish depending on clearance levels. I've read fan accounts, probably exaggerated but still chilling, about tech priests who entered certain sections of the tower and emerged weeks later with no memory of what they did inside. It's like the tower isn't just a building, but a mechanism, some kind of cognitive labyrinth designed to test, trap, or transform whoever walks its halls. Functionally, the tower was far more than a military command center. It served as a research facility, a communications nexus, a barracks, a prison, and, some whisper, a vault for the Emperor's darkest secrets. There are entire levels said to be sealed since the earliest days of the Imperium, doors that haven't been opened in over 10,000 years. What's behind them? No one knows, and that's what makes this place so maddeningly fascinating. The fact that the tower still stands, untouched and unspoken of, in the most secure location in the galaxy, is like a cosmic dare. Every silence screams, something is down there. One of the most persistent myths revolves around the black obelisks found deep within the sub-basements of the tower, unmarked, humming faintly, and never moved. Some fans believe they're psychically reactive, that they amplify the Emperor's will across the planet or even serve as anchor points for his divine presence. Others say they're containment devices for something far older, far worse. I've even heard wild speculation that the tower was constructed as a kind of lock, and if opened incorrectly, it might unseal something that was never meant to walk free again. Even among the custodies who guard the tower with silent vigilance, there's a strange tension. It's said they rotate their watches more often there than anywhere else on Terra. Some think it's because of psychic strain. Others suspect something else entirely. Maybe the tower affects time or memory or even sanity. There's one account I came across in a banned data thread where a former custodian hinted at rooms that show you your own death over and over until you forget which version was real, obviously unverifiable. But still, that kind of rumor doesn't just come from nowhere. What strikes me most is how the tower feels like an unresolved story. The rest of the Imperial Palace is constantly evolving, sections rebuilt, expanded, converted into shrines or archives. But the Tower of Hegemon hasn't changed. No renovations, no visible additions. It's like it's frozen in time, resisting the march of centuries, almost like it's waiting. And that's what gives people chills even now. The idea that this place, the literal foundation of the Imperium, was never meant to be a relic or museum. It might still be active in some unfathomable way. That behind the walls, behind the blank, cold facade, something is watching, not sleeping, watching. When people ask me why the tower scares me more than any hive of chaos cults or Xeno's tomb world, I tell them this. Because it's here, right at the heart of everything. Because the scariest monsters aren't the ones in the warp or at the edge of the galaxy. They're the ones buried beneath our feet, hidden in the silence of stone and shadow, behind doors that were never meant to open. And the Tower of Hegemon? It's made entirely of those doors. During the age of unification, the Tower of Hegemon wasn't just a command post, it was the eye of the storm. When we talk about the Emperor during those years, we're not talking about a golden god on a throne, but a warlord, a tactician, a conqueror wearing practical armor, surrounded not by saints and scribes, but by warriors and gene-forged monsters. And at the center of all that brutal ambition stood the tower, silent, calculating, merciless. It didn't rise to power with the Imperium. It birthed the Imperium. Back then, Earth, or Terra as we now call it, was a battlefield more fractured than any war zone in the modern galaxy. There were techno-barbarian clans wielding scrap-built war engines, remnants of gene cults, psychic tyrants, cannibal tribes with ancient nukes, and even rogue AI systems left over from the Dark Age. The planet was a shattered ruin of civilization clawing at its own remains. And amidst that chaos, the Emperor began to unify it all, not with sermons or diplomacy, but with thunder. And the tower? It was the mind behind the fist. While the Emperor led campaigns across the Himalaysians, Urals, and across the scorched plains of Pan-Pacifica, the tower coordinated the entire war machine. It was the operations hub for his early forces, the Thunder Warriors, brutal, short-lived giants who were never meant to survive peace. From here, their deployments were managed, targets selected, and resistance analyzed. I've read accounts claiming that entire enemy factions were wiped out simply from the data being fed through the tower's systems, predictive algorithms, strategic AI subroutines, and the Emperor's own psychic oversight combined into a terrifying force of preemptive warfare. But it wasn't just war plans. The tower was also a forge of ideology. The Emperor wasn't only trying to win battles. He was trying to shape belief, to build a vision of humanity united under reason, science, and absolute control. It's easy to forget that before the Imperial cult ever existed, there was another dream, one based on the Imperial truth. The tower played a massive role in formulating and broadcasting this early doctrine. It was here that scribes, philosophers, and scientists under the Emperor's guidance compiled the frameworks that would later become the foundation of the Imperium's secular dogma. Of course, the tower's influence extended beyond Earth itself. As the unification began turning into expansion, it was from this fortress that contact was attempted with Martian enclaves, with Luna's bioconstruct guilds, and even with deep ocean survival vaults that had sealed themselves off during the Age of Strife. A lot of those negotiations were short, cold, and backed by orbital bombardment if needed. But they always began at the tower. It was a symbol of the Emperor's authority before his name was ever whispered like a prayer. Some particularly intense fan theories even claim that the tower functioned as an early form of a warp suppression zone, keeping psychers in check long before the Sisters of Silence or the Black Ships existed. There's mention, fragmented and suppressed, of psychic labs in the tower where the earliest proto-nulls were bred and tested. If that's true, then the horrors of the pariah gene and the nightmare of blankness might have found their origin not in some Mechanicus vault, but right under the tower itself. Another thing that comes up in old fragments is the sheer brutality the tower orchestrated. While we usually imagine the Emperor as this semi-benevolent force trying to save humanity, the reality of unification was ruthless. The tower was a place where dissenting populations were marked for extinction with a single keystroke. You didn't get warning shots, you got extermination. There's a sense that, within those dark walls, the Emperor surrounded himself with strategists and genesmiths who didn't think in human lives, but in acceptable loss ratios. That cold efficiency shaped the Imperium in ways we still live with today. And yet, despite all this control and power, the tower wasn't some massive public beacon. It wasn't there to inspire the people. In fact, most common citizens of Terra never even saw it. Its silhouette haunted the skyline, sure, but it didn't project propaganda or ceremony. It didn't need to. Its power was quiet, undeniable, and absolute. Even then, it carried an atmosphere of secrecy. Only those chosen by the Emperor walked its halls during unification, and most of them were never seen again after their work was done. Some say that entire projects were buried in its depths. Bioweapons, psychic amplifiers, maybe even the first stabs at creating the primarchs. But no one knows for sure. What fascinates me is how little remains of that time in official records. We have statues of the Thunder Warriors, of course. We have murals showing the Emperor striding across battlefields with lightning in his eyes. But the tower? It barely shows up in sanctioned texts. It's like the Imperium wants to forget that it ever needed such a brutal instrument. And maybe that's why we should talk about it more. Because if the Imperium was born from fire and steel, the Tower of Hegemon was the forge. It wasn't just the brain of the unification, it was the soul, if such a thing can exist in a place built for silence and death. Understanding its role during that time isn't just about history. It's about understanding the kind of power that shaped our entire galaxy. And that power, as terrifying as it sounds, still lingers in those walls. If you think the Tower of Hegemon is unsettling on the surface, you haven't heard the stories about what lies beneath it. And trust me, once you go down that rabbit hole, it becomes really hard to sleep peacefully again. Because while the upper levels of the tower are grim, militaristic, and coldly utilitarian, it's the sublevels, the sprawling, forbidden underworld beneath the tower, that truly haunt the imagination of those who care enough to dig. There's a persistent rumor that the tower has sublevels descending more than 100 floors deep, far below what's officially mapped. That number is already terrifying, but some fans believe even that's a conservative estimate. I've seen theories that claim the tower doesn't just go underground, it goes through the crust of Terra itself, linking to ancient Dark Age vaults and buried structures that predate even the Emperor. There's something about the idea of descending through layer after layer of silence, cold stone, and blinking machinery, only to find yourself in a chamber where the air hasn't moved in 10,000 years. That sends a chill down your spine. So what's down there? That's the golden question. And of course, there are no official answers. The Imperium doesn't exactly offer guided tours of its most secret places, but the few scraps of data that have leaked out, combined with centuries of speculation, paint a disturbing picture. One of the most persistent theories is that the lower levels of the Tower House laboratories where the earliest genetic experiments took place. I'm not just talking about Astartes prototypes or Primarch-related work. I mean the raw stuff, the kind of experimentation that makes even the Mechanicus raise an eyebrow. Some whispers suggest that the tower's labs were the testing grounds for weaponized psychers, blanks, pariahs, and variants so unstable they had to be kept in permanent stasis. There are reports, again highly censored, of containment units buried deep beneath the tower that pulse with unnatural energy, guarded by custodes who never speak and whose faces are hidden behind visors sealed for life. One fan theory claims that one of these vaults contains a proto-AI psychic interface, a remnant of forbidden tech from the Dark Age of technology that the Emperor chose not to destroy, but rather to observe. And then there are the prisons. Not the kind with cells and bars, at least not in the traditional sense. The dungeons beneath the tower were never meant for criminals in the usual way. These were containment areas for individuals, entities, and constructs that posed existential threats. I once read a theory that during Unification, certain warlords and psyker tyrants weren't executed. They were locked away under the tower, encased in null fields so intense that even time seemed to avoid them. Some fans go further, suggesting that some of the prisoners aren't even human. That the tower serves as a vault for things that defy classification. Warp anomalies given form, forgotten Xenos hybrids, even early chaos-corrupted entities that were somehow captured rather than destroyed. What really unnerves me, though, are the Black Archives. Mentioned only in the most obscure lore, they're said to be buried in a sealed sector of the tower's depths, guarded not by force fields or bolter turrets, but by information itself. The legend says these archives are written in languages no longer spoken, encoded in thought patterns that require psychic alignment just to read. These aren't just lost texts, they're intentionally buried truths. Files on failed experiments, data on alternate timelines, warnings about futures the Emperor tried to prevent. Some even say there's a vault containing the full, unredacted story of the Primarch project, what went wrong, who interfered, and why 20 Primarchs became 18. There's even this creepy bit of lore about a place called Level Null. It's supposedly the lowest accessible floor, but no one knows how to reach it. It's not on any maps, and not even the Mechanicus have schematics that confirm it exists. But the rumors persist. People talk about whispers in the walls, flickers of movement on Auspex scanners, entire custodes patrols that were reassigned with no record of where they were stationed. One fan theory claims that Level Null is where the Emperor conducts his own experiments in secret, using shards of his consciousness projected from the Golden Throne. Is it nonsense? Probably. But the way it's always avoided in discussions, it makes you wonder. Another angle I've seen debated is the idea that the tower's underbelly is a kind of psychic sinkhole, like the collective weight of all the horror, experimentation, and forbidden tech down there has warped the very nature of reality. Imagine a place where the warp refuses to enter, not because of protection, but because it's been poisoned by something worse. That might explain why even the Inquisition is hesitant to dig too deep into the tower's lower levels. Some truths are better left buried. It's easy to dismiss these things as myth, fan fiction, overactive imaginations. But that's the thing about the Imperium. The truth is always worse than the rumors. And when every shadow under the Tower of Hegemon is guarded, classified, or outright denied, it tells me that whatever's down there isn't just dangerous, it's essential. Too essential to destroy, too terrible to expose. What scares me the most is the idea that these lower levels are still active, that the machines are still humming, the experiments are still monitored, and someone, or something, is still watching. Not from the walls, but from behind sealed doors that haven't opened in 10,000 years. The tower isn't a tomb, it's a vault, and we have no idea what it's really keeping locked away. This is the part of the story where everything gets hazy, uncertain, and just a little bit forbidden. Because when we talk about the creation of the primarchs, those demigod sons of the Emperor who would go on to lead the Legiones Astartes and shape the galaxy, we're stepping into one of the most tightly sealed chapters in Imperial history. And yet, there are threads, hints, and whispers that all seem to point back to one place: the Tower of Hegemon. The official records are vague to the point of insult. We're told that the Emperor crafted the primarchs using a combination of gene forging, warp manipulation, and psychic artistry unlike anything before or since. But the where of it all? That's brushed aside, buried in generalized phrases like deep within Terra or within the Emperor's sanctum. But when you look at the timeline, when you consider where the Emperor had absolute control, the facilities he trusted, and the silence surrounding them, the tower starts to look suspiciously like Ground Zero. Many fans believe that the earliest stages of the Primarch project were conducted right in the tower's deepest vaults, not in the later, more refined labs of Luna or the biochambers beneath Mars, but here, within the brutal sealed core of the first fortress. It makes sense if you think about it. During the Unification Wars, the Emperor was consolidating power, eliminating rivals, and building a new kind of future. The Thunder Warriors, powerful as they were unstable, short-lived, and ultimately a stopgap. The next phase, the true generals of the coming crusade, had to be something else, something divine, something designed not just to conquer, but to embody his will. Some theories go even deeper. There's an old data fragment that's been passed around fan circles for years, heavily redacted and almost certainly apocryphal, that describes a series of biochambers located below the tower, each calibrated to unique genetic frequencies. The text references 20 Cradle pylons, each marked with a number, never names. It hints that the Emperor would descend alone to these chambers, interacting directly with the developing forms, speaking to them even before they were conscious. If true, it suggests that the Primarchs weren't just lab-grown warriors. They were deeply personal projects, shaped by the Emperor's hand in ways we can barely comprehend. What's particularly eerie is the implication that each Primarch was designed not just with physical perfection, but with a specific narrative in mind. Their personalities, temperaments, even their flaws. Some believe all of it was intentional. And if those designs began in the tower, that makes the place not just a military command post, but a kind of myth-making crucible, the very soil from which gods were grown. There's also a persistent fan theory that the catastrophic warp event that scattered the Primarchs across the galaxy didn't originate from sabotage on Luna, as is often claimed, but from within the tower itself. That perhaps the Emperor was experimenting with warp manipulation, trying to bind the Primarchs' destinies through psychic pathways, and something went wrong. Or worse, something went right in a way no one expected. The theory suggests that the tower housed a warp-reactive core, maybe even a tether to the Emperor's own nascent godhood, and that the shattering of the gestation pods was the result of that interaction with the Imperium. It's all speculation, of course, but when you combine it with the way the tower is treated even now, it starts to feel less like conspiracy and more like intentional silence. Why else would the tower be so rigorously guarded? Why would even the Mechanicus avoid interfacing with certain sections of its lower vaults? If the Primarchs were created there, that knowledge would be more than historically valuable. It would be dangerous. It would force the Imperium to confront the artificial nature of its divine figures. And that's not a story the ecclesiarchy would ever want to see the light of day. There are also some deeply unsettling accounts, found only in heretical texts and fringe fan writings, that claim there were more than 20. That in the early phases, the Emperor created dozens of prototypes, some unstable, some deformed, some too powerful to control, and that the tower became their burial ground. A kind of genetic oubliette, where the mistakes of a god were locked away in the dark. If that's true, it casts the tower not just as a birthplace, but as a tomb. Some even go further, suggesting that certain corridors of the tower shift not because of physical design, but because of psychic resonance left behind by the primarchs themselves. That the tower remembers them, that echoes of their presence still linger like fingerprints on glass. I know how far-fetched it sounds, but in a galaxy where psychic ghosts can drive men mad, is it really that hard to believe? To me, the most powerful argument for the tower's role in the Primarch's creation isn't found in the lore. It's in the silence. The way no one talks about what happened there. The way it's left out of the myths. If the Primarchs were truly the Emperor's greatest works, wouldn't the place of their creation be honored, celebrated, turned into a shrine? And yet the tower is hidden, avoided, buried under layers of distraction and bureaucracy. That's not forgetfulness. That's fear. Fear of what we might find if we start asking the wrong questions. Fear that the legends we've been told about the Emperor's sons are just that, legends. And that beneath those legends lies a truth no one is ready to face. If the Tower of Hegemon really is the cradle of the Primarchs, then everything we think we know about them, about their purpose, their failures, their betrayals, has to be re-examined. Because maybe they weren't meant to save the Imperium. Maybe they were just another experiment, another attempt, another dream grown in the dark under a fortress that still refuses to speak. It's easy to imagine that the Tower of Hegemon is nothing more than an abandoned relic, a sealed monument to a long-finished war. That its walls have grown silent, its chambers dark, its influence buried beneath the weight of 10,000 years of imperial sprawl. But that's not the case, not even close, because for all its shadows and secrecy, the tower is very much alive, and more disturbingly, it's still pulling strings. The thing is, no one really knows who occupies the tower these days. Not officially, anyway. There's no formal roster, no known leadership structure, no published orders or decrees. But if you talk to anyone who spent enough time studying the political machinery of the Imperium, they'll tell you the same thing. Decisions get made there. Decisions that echo through Segmentum Solar. Decisions that somehow ripple through the highest echelons of the High Lord's agendas. It's like a secondary command node, one that doesn't sit on the stage but controls the lighting from behind the curtains. Some believe it's still a military intelligence hub, that deep within its core sits an ancient logic engine, perhaps even a protocognitor from the dark age of technology, fed constantly by encrypted data from across the galaxy. From this machine, or group of machines depending on which theory you believe, the tower generates strategic guidance for the Administratum, the Astra Militarum, and the Segmentum commands. These orders don't come with seals or names. They come through intermediaries, strange figures who arrive unannounced, speak with absolute authority, and vanish just as quickly. Other fans think the tower has become a sanctuary for one of the oldest and most secretive factions in the Imperium. Not the Inquisition, not the Custodes, not even the Ordo Redactus. Something older. A remnant of the Emperor's original think tank. Strategists, advisors, scientists, and philosophers who were never publicly acknowledged but were too valuable to discard. These are the so-called silent regents, as some call them. They don't rule per se, but they influence the shape of imperial policy in ways most people can't even trace. Some believe that every major doctrinal shift, from the restructuring of the Officio Assassinorum to the timing of crusades, originates from this hidden cabal within the tower. Even the High Lords themselves, Those massive bureaucratic and religious figures who claim to lead the Imperium in the Emperor's name seem wary of the tower. There are stories of closed sessions where certain topics are avoided, not because of protocol, but because they belong to the tower. It's said that when conflicting orders emerge, one sealed with the tower's sigil always takes precedence, and no one ever asks why. There's also this strange notion, floated by more speculative minds, that the tower is not merely influencing policy, but is also watching, not metaphorically, but literally. That hidden within its structure are vast surveillance systems capable of peering across time and space. That's a bit of a stretch, sure, but when you consider the technology once available during the Dark Age and the fact that the tower predates nearly all current Imperial structures, it starts to feel less impossible. Maybe it doesn't need eyes because it already sees everything. Some have even gone as far as suggesting that the tower is the reason why certain individuals within the Imperium rise so fast. That it's behind the inexplicable promotions, the seemingly random disappearances, and the sudden deaths of those who ask the wrong questions. It's not hard to imagine. In a political landscape as brutal and chaotic as the Imperium's, having a structure like the tower acting as a pressure valve or invisible hand would explain a lot of odd patterns. It's the ghost in the system, the unacknowledged force that keeps the machine grinding forward. And yet, despite all this, the tower is never mentioned in the sermons of the ecclesiarchy. It's never praised in public declarations or turned into a symbol of imperial faith. It remains outside the mythos. That's the part that really sticks with me. In a galaxy where shrines are built to servo skulls and saints are canonized for surviving warp storms, the tower, a literal birthplace of imperial power, is left in the dark, not forgotten, just omitted. Deliberately. Some fans take that to mean the tower holds a darker purpose. That maybe, just maybe, it wasn't built to rule, but to counterbalance rule. That the Emperor foresaw the descent into stagnation, corruption, and fanatical decay, and created the tower as a control system, a quiet failsafe, a place where reason would survive when dogma took over. If that's true, then it's not just a political fortress. It's the last breath of a forgotten dream. Others are more cynical. They believe the tower is no longer under any form of coherent control, that it has become an engine of inertia, a ghost bureaucratic system with no master, issuing orders because it cannot stop, influencing policies out of self-sustaining protocol loops that no one understands anymore. The idea of a structure still governing the Imperium, not through intention, but through sheer momentum, is somehow even scarier than a secret cabal. What strikes me most is the consistency in these theories. No matter how wild they get, they all agree on one thing. The tower still matters. It's not just an old fortress. It's active. It's silent. And it has a say in how this galaxy is run, whether anyone admits it or not. So who's really in charge of the Imperium? The High Lords? The Inquisition? The Emperor himself, locked to the throne? Or is it something colder, older, deeper, watching from the shadows of a tower no one dares enter, quietly ensuring that the dream doesn't end and that it never truly begins again? When people talk about the Inquisition, the shadowy hand of the Imperium, the executioners of heresy, the guardians of mankind's survival, they usually picture robed figures moving through the void, backed by kill teams and ancient decrees. But every now and then, someone whispers something that changes the whole narrative. They say, if you want to find the real heart of the Inquisition, not the Ordos, not the Rosettes, but the origin, you need to look at the Tower of Hegemon. It's not confirmed, of course. Nothing with the Inquisition ever is. But there are too many signs to ignore. Too many blacked-out records that mention an audience chamber deep beneath the surface of the tower. Too many stories of inquisitors who disappear for decades, only to return changed, more focused, more terrifying, with authority no one can challenge. The common belief is that the Inquisition operates independently, scattered across thousands of star systems. But what if that's only true on the surface? What if there's a central node, a silent command post buried beneath Terra itself, where the real directives are decided? Some fans believe the tower houses what they call the Zero Order, a theoretical body of inquisitors so secretive, so powerful, they don't align with Ordo Malleus, Xenos, or Hereticus. These are the ones who monitor everything, not just heresy, but deviation, thought, history, even time itself. According to this theory, the tower acts as both archive and crucible, a place where knowledge too dangerous for even the Ordos is stored, studied, and, when necessary, erased from existence. What's especially eerie is how often the Inquisition avoids mentioning the tower in its own literature. You can comb through hundreds of inquisitorial documents, and you'll see references to secure terra sites, redacted vaults, and high-authority conclaves, but the tower is almost never named. That's not oversight. That's deliberate omission. And anyone who knows how the Inquisition works knows that they only fear what they can't control, or what controls them. There's a particularly disturbing theory that the tower isn't just a base of operations for the Inquisition, but a mirror to it. That it holds full, unredacted accounts of the Imperium's most horrific truths, the actual number of exterminatus events, the full scale of psycho abuse, the list of worlds where chaos wasn't purged, but contained. Think about that. An archive of everything the Imperium has done in the name of survival, unfiltered, raw, ugly truth. The kind of knowledge that would shatter the Imperial creed if it ever got out. And who else would need access to that truth, if not the Inquisition? I've read fan accounts that claim certain Inquisitors are made in the tower, not trained, not promoted, but forged. That those who are considered too dangerous, too independent, or too effective are brought here, stripped of identity, and rebuilt into something else. The term I've seen tossed around is null lords. No official badges, no visible signs of authority, but when they speak, entire Ordos listen. They're ghosts, not in the warp, but in the hierarchy of power. And if they exist, the tower is the only place they could come from. Another unsettling idea is that the tower is where the Inquisition tests ideas. Not weapons or tactics, ideas. It's no secret that the Inquisition deals in philosophical warfare as much as literal combat. The decision to allow a xeno-species to live. The question of what defines humanity. The debate over the Emperor's divinity. All of these aren't just abstract problems. They're policies that shape entire sectors. And what if the tower is the lab where these ideas are weighed? Where outcomes are simulated? Where decisions are made before they ever reach the High Lords or the battlefield? The deeper you go into this theory space, the more the tower feels less like a fortress and more like a control room for reality itself. One fan theory I can't shake claims that the tower contains what's called the Deep Archive, a psychic library encoded not in ink, but in memory. Supposedly, some Inquisitors undergo a process where their minds are copied, cataloged, and stored in a lattice of blank psychers, creating a collective consciousness of centuries of inquisitorial thought. If true, then the tower holds more than secrets. It holds minds. Thoughts that can be accessed, reshaped, or even weaponized. Of course, there's the darker side of this too. The idea that the tower doesn't just guard the truth, it distorts it. That Inquisitors who pass through its halls leave behind parts of themselves they'll never recover. That decisions made there are so morally bankrupt, so devoid of empathy, that only someone stripped of humanity can carry them out. I've seen it suggested that the tower runs on a kind of ideological entropy, that it consumes belief and spits out cold calculus. And yet, no one questions it. No one storms the gates, not even other branches of the Inquisition. That's the part that gives me chills. It's as if the tower sits at the crossroads of power and silence, untouchable, untouching, and yet always present. Like a node in the Imperium's nervous system, monitoring the pulse of the whole, waiting for anomalies, ready to excise them before they become visible. To me, the scariest thought is that the tower isn't just a place where secrets are kept. It's where the shape of the Imperium is decided. In rooms we'll never see, by minds we'll never know, using knowledge we were never meant to understand. And the Inquisition? They're not just guarding that truth, they're guarding the very fabric of humanity. They're living in it, swimming in it, drowning in it. So when someone asks me if the Tower of Hegemon hides the truth, I don't hesitate. Of course it does. But the real question is, does anyone inside even remember what truth looks like anymore? The Adeptus Mechanicus rarely speak plainly about anything, but when it comes to the Tower of Hegemon, their silence becomes something else entirely. It's not reverence, it's not ignorance, it's avoidance. And when the high priests of Mars go out of their way to pretend something doesn't exist, it usually means that thing is very important, or very dangerous, or both. The official line from the cult Mechanicus is that the tower is an ancient structure of pre-imperial significance, currently under preservation by decree of the Adeptus Terra. That's it. That's all they'll say. But behind closed vox links, among the lower-ranked tech adepts and half-drilled engine seers, the rumors are everywhere. The most common one? That the tower houses technology from before the Age of Strife, systems so advanced, so unorthodox, that even the Fabricator General himself has forbidden direct study. It's not hard to believe. The Mechanicus already considers most tech on Terra to be relic tier, but the tower feels like something else entirely. Some tech priests claim the materials that make up the tower's internal systems, its conduits, its lift rails, its sealed vaults, don't match any known fabrication pattern, that they react to input before commands are issued, that the walls remember being touched. One report, supposedly leaked from a Skitarii reconnaissance unit, describes a maintenance tunnel that folds into itself like origami when approached, locking the crew inside for over 40 hours before simply releasing them. That's not just architecture. That's something closer to machine intelligence, or worse, machine will. And the Mechanicus hates that, because it doesn't follow the litany of assembly, it doesn't align with known STCs, and it doesn't obey the dogma of the Omnisia. In a strange way, the tower defies the very structure of their belief. It's too functional, too unknowable, too independent, which is probably why they keep sending tech adepts in small, silent groups, never officially, always off the record, the kind of deployments that don't show up in the cogitator logs but are whispered about in the metal-lit chapels of Mars. Some fans think the tower contains a functioning standard template construct, a real one, not the fragments and corrupted blueprints that get passed around the galaxy like holy scripture. If that's true, it would explain a lot. STCs are like the mythical golden fleece to the Mechanicus, complete systems that can produce entire technologies, whole doctrines of engineering. A single functioning STC could revolutionize entire Forge worlds. And if one is hidden inside the tower, locked behind vaults of black stone and warp-inert seals, it would make the tower one of the most important technological sites in existence. But here's the kicker. What if it's not just a system? What if it's sentient? There's a deeply fringe theory that the tower is home to a pre-imperial AI, an entity that survived the Men of Iron, hid itself during the purges of the Age of Strife, and eventually came into contact with the Emperor himself. Some even believe this intelligence helped design the early infrastructure of the Imperium, possibly even advised on the Primarch project, and has been locked away ever since, watched over by the Mechanicus not as protectors, but as jailers. The tower wouldn't just be a fortress then. It would be a prison, a containment unit for something that defies both flesh and steel. That might sound like paranoid fan fiction, but the fact that tech priests still guard certain sections of the tower without explanation keeps the theory alive. Entire sects of the cult Mechanicus have been assigned to the tower and never seen again. No glory, no martyrdom, just reassignment into silence. Some say these adepts are chosen not for their faith, but for their doubt, for their willingness to think beyond dogma, to question, to listen. The kind of minds the Fabricator General would rather have locked in a vault than wandering the halls of Mars. Another layer to this mystery is the machine temples rumored to be hidden under the tower's foundations. These aren't your typical prayer chambers filled with incense smoke and binary chants. These are sealed, humming shrines filled with devices no one fully understands, machines that glow with internal light, respond only to certain genetic codes, and occasionally speak. Not in words, not even in data, in dreams, in sudden visions. There's this one legend about a tech priest who sat in meditation in one of these hidden shrines and came back speaking a new dialect of binaric that no one else had ever heard. They say he wrote down equations that describe time as a solvable algorithm. He was executed, of course, but his notes vanished into a locked vault beneath the tower. The Mechanicus isn't afraid of ignorance. They thrive on it. But they are terrified of heresy, of machines that don't need prayers to function, of code that writes itself, of intelligence that looks back. And the tower? It's full of those things. It doesn't need maintenance. It doesn't corrode. It doesn't decay. It exists outside the cycle of entropy that governs all other imperial structures. That alone would be enough to classify it as a tech heresy of the highest order. What really gets under my skin is the idea that the tower is older than the Mechanicus itself. That the Emperor may have built it with technologies he refused to share, even with his so-called allies on Mars. That the tower's systems are his alone, crafted in silence, encoded with safeguards that even the tech priests can't decode. If that's true, it would make the tower the last true example of pre-Mechanicus human mastery over machine. Something pure, untouched by superstition, untainted by ritual, and that would explain everything. Why the Mechanicus won't speak of it, why they guard it in silence, why they let others believe it's just a fortress while they slip deeper into its veins, trying and failing to understand it. To me, the Tower of Hegemon isn't just a hidden node of power. It's a challenge, a whisper from the past, asking the Mechanicus whether they serve machines or fear them. And judging by how they treat the tower, I think we already know the answer. There's something deeply unsettling about the idea that the Tower of Hegemon might not be empty. That somewhere behind all that silence and stone, something or someone still lives. It's one thing to imagine old archives humming in the dark or forgotten machines waiting to wake. But sentient life? Conscious presence, hidden for 10,000 years in the shadow of the Emperor's throne. That's when the tower stops being just a monument and starts to feel like a prison. Or worse, a sanctuary for things too strange to exist anywhere else. People love to talk about the High Lords of Terra, about the ecclesiarchy and the custodes, but almost no one dares to speculate who, if anyone, actually inhabits the tower. And yet, the rumors persist. The oldest one that predates even the Horus heresy, according to some, is that the tower houses the Emperor's original council. Not the ones we know from sanctioned histories, but an earlier group, the First Circle. Supposedly, they were the advisors, engineers, and philosophers who helped plan the unification of Terra and the foundation of the Legiones Astartes. Not warriors, thinkers, designers of systems, and not a single one of them was ever seen again after the Great Crusade began. What happened to them? Theories abound. Some say they died in silence, their minds broken by what they saw during the Primarch project. Others believe they were locked away, either to protect the secrets they carried or because they became the secrets. Immortality through stasis or psychic suspension. A few voices on the fringe claim they're still alive beneath the tower, dreaming, thinking, guiding policy through forgotten channels. They're not human anymore, if they ever were. They've seen too much. They remember too much. And the Imperium fears what they might say if they ever walked free again. Another widely circulated theory is that the tower contains clones, not of random subjects, but of the Emperor himself. Failed echoes, partial recreations, experimental prototypes. The reasoning is simple. If the tower was the birthplace of the primarchs, why wouldn't it also be the testing ground for replicating the one who created them? Some claim that early efforts to understand the Emperor's biology resulted in dozens, maybe hundreds, of half-sold copies, each slightly wrong, each missing something vital. These echoes, unable to die but too broken to live, are said to be entombed in the tower's lower crypts, sealed away from the world that rejected them. The most persistent version of this idea even suggests that one of the clones succeeded, not perfectly, but enough. That deep within the tower resides a being who thinks he is the Emperor, or maybe one who used to think so, but has since fallen into madness. What does it mean to be a shadow of a god, hidden away and forgotten? Fans theorize that this entity is kept in stasis, monitored by a select cadre of the Adeptus Custodes, allowed to exist only because it might serve some future contingency, a fallback option, a second chance, a living lie. And then there's the truly bizarre, the Shadow Emperor theory. This one goes way out there, but it's got traction among the deep lore obsessives. It suggests that the Emperor projected part of his essence into the tower just before being interred in the Golden Throne. Not his body, not his soul, but something in between, a psychic imprint or echo that still lingers within the tower's walls. It doesn't move, it doesn't speak, but it watches. Some say it appears to certain individuals in their dreams, pulling them toward the tower with visions and whispers. Others believe this presence subtly manipulates events, influencing decisions in ways too quiet to trace. It's not the Emperor reborn. It's the part of him that refused to die. Even the Custodes act strange around the tower. They never speak of it. They never mention who's inside. But they are always there, silent, unmoving, golden statues guarding doors that supposedly lead nowhere. Why waste their strength guarding an empty fortress? Why cycle out their assignments from the tower more often than anywhere else on Terra? Some think it's to prevent familiarity, to stop any single custodian from learning too much about what or who lurks within. There's a particularly chilling idea I came across in a data thread once, posted by someone who claimed to have served in the lower administratum near the tower. According to them, there's a single room inside the tower that no one enters, not even the Custodes. A black chamber with no known function, no designation, no access code. And yet, food is delivered to it. Fresh robes, maintenance requests. The implication? Someone lives there, or something is pretending to. I've also seen references to what some call the Pale Choir, a group of psychers who dwell within the tower, bound not by chains but by ritual. Supposedly, they're not servants of the Astronomicon, nor sanctioned by the Scholastia Psychana. There's something else. A choir that doesn't sing to the stars, but listens to Terra itself. To the tower. Some even believe these psychers are blind, their eyes burned out by the visions they receive, but their minds are clearer than any living human. They speak only to one another. They never leave. And they are never, ever named. It's hard to separate truth from madness at this point. The tower has become so saturated in myth, conspiracy, and fear that even the wildest stories start to sound plausible. And maybe that's part of the plan. If enough noise surrounds the tower, no one will know what to believe. The secrets remain safe, buried in a fog of speculation. But still, you can't help but wonder, because the tower feels inhabited. It's too well maintained, too closely watched. The lights never go out. The doors never rust. Supplies keep arriving. Voices echo through the stone when no one's supposed to be there. Every story, every shadow, every glance from a custodian who lingers too long at a sealed door, it all adds up to one terrifying idea. That the Tower of Hegemon isn't just a place of the past. It's a home. A sanctum for those the Imperium would rather forget, and maybe, just maybe, a throne for something that's still waiting. And whatever lives there, it remembers everything. There's one theory that's always stuck with me. Not because it's the most dramatic or the most plausible, but because it feels true in a way that's hard to explain. It's the idea that the Tower of Hegemon isn't just a physical place, but a kind of echo. A memory the Imperium is still carrying around like a scar, whether it admits it or not. That maybe the tower isn't dangerous because of what's in it, but because of what it reminds us of. What we once were, what we could have become, and what we chose to bury. I mean, think about it. Every major symbol of the Imperium has been glorified, mythologized, or turned into dogma. The Golden Throne is a holy relic. The Astronomicon is a beacon of divine light. Even the broken wrecks of ancient battleships become shrines covered in incense and prayers. But the tower? No statues, no chants, no pilgrimage, just silence. And in a regime that's built on symbolism, that silence is louder than any hymn. Some people say that's because the tower is cursed, that the very foundation it rests on is saturated with psychic residue, failed experiments, tortured souls, even warp entities that were trapped, not destroyed. I've seen lore threads that go deep into this, speculating that the tower is like a psychic dead zone, where no astropath dares enter, and even the most devout confessors feel something unnatural scraping at the edge of their minds. It's like a place that knows too much, and wants you to know it too, like it's whispering to the ones who linger too long. And then there's this strange pattern that's been noticed among Imperial scholars and scribes. The ones who study the tower, even from afar, don't tend to last long. Not in terms of life necessarily, but in function. They burn out, they vanish, they go silent. It's almost like the tower erases people, not physically, but spiritually. Like engaging with it too deeply pulls something out of you that doesn't come back. Some fans call it the Black Echo, a kind of existential fatigue that sets in after you've spent too much time trying to unravel the tower's secrets. I can't help but wonder if that's the point. Maybe the tower isn't just guarding something, it's testing something, filtering, watching to see who keeps digging and who gives up. And maybe, just maybe, it rewards the ones who don't turn away. There's this deeply speculative idea that the tower isn't static at all, that it has layers that shift depending on the observer, that certain doors only appear when you're ready to walk through them. Sounds like classic sci-fi fantasy stuff, I know, but this is Warhammer. Stranger things have happened. There's also something weird about the way time seems to twist around the tower in the few reports we do get. There are rumors of internal clocks that run backward, of data logs recorded before their authors were born, of servitors that speak in dialects no longer used. Some even believe the tower is caught in a kind of temporal feedback loop, an echo chamber of its own history, endlessly replaying certain moments, certain decisions, over and over again. If that's true, then maybe the tower isn't a tomb or a fortress, but a loop, a broken recording of a galaxy that never became what it was meant to. What really hits me, though, is how the tower challenges the whole narrative of the Imperium. It's like this quiet, immovable contradiction at the center of everything. A reminder that the Emperor wasn't always a god, that the Imperium wasn't always built on faith and fire. That once upon a time, there was a plan. And maybe the tower is the last trace of that plan, a structure too heavy to destroy, too true to erase. I think a lot of us as fans get drawn to the tower because it feels unfinished. Everything else in Warhammer has an arc. Heroes rise, fall, die, get reborn, get corrupted. Battles rage, empires collapse, monsters ascend. But the tower? It just sits there, watching, waiting, like a sentence that never got its period. And that makes it strangely powerful, because in a universe where everything is in motion, the tower is still. And that stillness demands attention. Maybe one day, Games Workshop will finally give us more detail, open up the vaults, show us what's really inside. But I almost hope they don't, because the mystery is part of the magic. The tower is one of those rare parts of the setting that still belongs to us, the readers, the fans, the theorists. It's our sandbox, our puzzle, our monster in the basement, and in a weird way, that makes the tower more real than most of the Imperium's sacred icons, because it's alive in our heads. Every theory we whisper, every wild thread we post, every video we make, it feeds the tower, keeps it relevant, keeps it watching. So maybe that's the truth we've been circling around this whole time. Maybe the Tower of Hegemon isn't a mystery to be solved. Maybe it's a question that asks us, what do we believe? What do we fear? What do we want the Imperium to be? And most importantly, What are we willing to forget to make that dream feel real? So after everything, the whispered legends, the blacked-out archives, the theories about secret councils, buried clones, hidden gods, what are we actually left with when it comes to the Tower of Hegemon? What's real? What's myth? Can we trust any of it? That's the part that keeps gnawing at me. Because the tower isn't just some obscure relic from early Imperial history. It's here, on Terra, in the heart of the Imperial Palace, just a few kilometers from the Golden Throne itself. It's not lost, it's not forgotten. And yet it's treated like a ghost, visible to all, spoken of by none. For a society obsessed with monuments and martyrdom, that kind of silence is deafening. It makes you wonder what it means to forget something on purpose. To erase a place not by destroying it, but by never acknowledging it again. The Tower of Hegemon could have been turned into a museum, a shrine, a chapel of imperial truth, or even of the Emperor's divinity. But instead, it's left in a state of eternal ambiguity, guarded, sealed, yet always present. It's like a wound that never heals, or a vault that no one dares open. Some fans like to say the tower represents the Imperium's original sin, that it's the place where the Emperor set aside compassion for control, vision for secrecy, unity for domination, that everything that went wrong, the heresy, the stagnation, the endless wars, can be traced back to the cold decisions made within its walls. It's not hard to see why that idea sticks. The tower was built during the Unification, perfected during the Crusade, and then buried during the Age of Worship. It's the architectural embodiment of everything the Imperium used to be, and maybe everything it was never supposed to become. Others argue the opposite, that the tower isn't a shameful memory but a last hope, a buried safeguard, locked away until the day comes when it's needed most. The Emperor didn't destroy it. He didn't collapse it into the crust or turn it into a reliquary. He kept it intact, functional, alive. That alone speaks volumes. Maybe he knew the Imperium would lose its way. Maybe he left the tower untouched because it was the only part of his empire not yet corrupted by faith or fear. A place where logic might still survive the long night. But even that idea is dangerous, because if there's one thing the Imperium cannot tolerate, it's contradiction. The tower stands as a contradiction in stone. It defies the ecclesiarchy, undermines the High Lords, unsettles the Mechanicus, and sidesteps the Inquisition. It is a fortress of ifs in a galaxy that insists on absolutes, and that might be why it's so compelling. Because in a universe of lies, here is a place that might hold the truth and refuses to share it. And yet, despite all of this, we don't know anything for sure. That's what really gets under the skin. We've built a whole mythology around this place, and it's based on scraps, shadows, and gut feeling. Every theory could be wrong. Every rumor could be a plant. For all we know, the tower could be empty, just a sealed bunker kept intact out of habit. Or maybe it's already active, and we simply can't see the effects yet. Or maybe it's both, hollow on the surface, but alive where it matters most, beneath, behind, within. That's the power of the tower. It forces us to question everything. The nature of imperial history, the reliability of sanctioned knowledge, the role of secrecy in a regime built on suppression, even the nature of the Emperor himself. Did he build the tower as a tool, a sanctuary, a trap, a mirror? The real question isn't what's inside the tower. It's whether we can ever handle what's inside. Whether we as imperial citizens, or even just fans of the lore, are prepared for the truths buried under centuries of willful silence. Because once you start pulling at the threads that lead to the tower, you realize how much of the Imperium's story is just set dressing, carefully written, rewritten, erased, and replaced. Maybe we're not supposed to know. Maybe the tower exists because we're not supposed to know. Maybe its silence is the message. A lesson that some truths were never meant for the light, that some knowledge costs more than it's worth. But I'm not convinced. Not completely. Because for all its shadows and warnings, the Tower of Hegemon still stands. And in this universe, anything that still stands after 10,000 years is meant to be noticed. So here's my take. Maybe the tower is more than a secret. Maybe it's a test, a challenge to those of us who still care enough to ask questions, a way to separate the curious from the obedient, the heretics from the historians, the fools from the faithful, and maybe, just maybe, the tower is waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to walk inside and finally ask, out loud, the question that's been echoing in its halls since the day it was built. Why was this place ever allowed to exist? If you've made it this far, you're already asking the right questions. And who knows? Maybe that means you're one step closer to the answer, or to becoming part of the tower's next chapter. Thanks for watching. And remember, sometimes the darkest truths are hidden in plain stone. Subscribe if you want more forbidden histories from the heart of the Imperium. The secrets are only just beginning.